And I want to start off this morning with the story from our scriptures. Now, this is one of the few stories in the Bible where we know exactly where it happened. Archaeologists discovered the Pool of Isetta about 150 years ago. And it has 5 porticos because there is this sort of wall, this portico that goes down the middle of the Pool of Isetta. And there are steps down into one of the basins of the pool, and it's a shallow pool. It was used for ritual washings. And so this is a kind of, you might think of it as like a large baptismal font kind of a structure. Now, this idea that people could go down into the pool and be healed there, that was not a Jewish idea. That actually comes from paganism and was popular in lots of places around the area. So I don't know how excited that Jesus is about these Jewish people practicing this sort of pagan practice. But what we do know is that Jesus is very interested in this paralytic man. He's been there for 38 years waiting for healing, and Jesus asked him a really pointed question. He says, "Do you even want to be healed?" Now, that may seem like a silly question to us, because of course this man has been waiting for 38 years. Of course he wants to be healed. Jesus, this man wants to walk out of here. But I would guess that Jesus' question here is not all that different than questions that you or I might ask if we were to go walking in downtown Indy together. I've heard it said, I've heard people wonder, does that beggar really want their situation to change? It seems like they would just go get a job. They would reach out to the help that's available to them. And I think underlying this question is an assumption. This person actually doesn't want anything to change in their life. They're actually happy begging. And of course, that usually includes us making judgments about them, because we can't imagine a world where you wouldn't want your situation to improve. And if we talk with professionals who regularly work with homeless folks and folks who are begging on the streets, we find out that there actually might be some truth to that. So I'll come back to that idea in just a moment. But maybe this is why Jesus is asking the question. Jesus knows that some of the beggars who have gathered at the water don't really want to be healed. In the years that he's been coming here, for 38 years, surely he could find someone who would just lower him down into the water. Surely he could find a friend who would help him get his healing. So maybe he doesn't actually want to be healed at all. Now, when you talk with folks who work with the homeless population on a regular basis, social workers will tell you that there are some homeless folks who would actually prefer to live in the tent cities or in shelters or on the streets. Not because that's a good life by any means, but in the mix of poverty and addiction and mental illness, it sometimes can be easier in the loss of your dignity to stay in the place that you know than to make a change. You see, many people fear change. We can be talking about a beggar receiving healing, or we can talk about changing our worship times at church. None of us want to change anything. We almost universally regard change as a bad thing. We fight it. We do all that we can to retain things the way they are. But why? Why do we fear change? Why would we rather keep things the way they are than to help see an improvement? Well, friends, I don't believe that we fear change at all. It's not change that we fear. It's uncertainty that we fear. Let me explain what I mean. In 2015, University College London had a research study done, and they put people in a game. And in the game, you had to turn over virtual rocks. And under the virtual rocks, under some of them, were virtual snakes. Now, if you turned over a virtual rock and there was a virtual snake underneath, you got a very real electrical shock. And they made it hurt a little bit. Now, the researchers would change the frequency with which you would find a snake under a rock over the course of the study. Now, sometimes it would be very high and you were almost certain to get an electrical shock, and other times it would near 50-50, and other times the frequency would be quite low at the likelihood you would get a shock. They learned a couple things. The first thing that they learned is that the human brain is highly attuned to figure out how certain something is. It's actually something that the brain does very well to figure out. They almost always knew what the likelihood was at where they were in the game. The second thing, and maybe more interesting for us, is that when the certainty that they were going to get shocked was at its highest, we might suspect would be the time when they would be the most stressed. But actually, they were the most stressed when this likelihood came near to 50-50. You might think that when we know that bad things are about to happen, we sort of resolve ourselves to our situation. We sort of just recognize that this terrible thing is going to happen, and we kind of pick ourselves and move on. But when we are unsure, we get really stressed out, and we do everything that we can to improve our situation. You might imagine for a moment a sports team. When the score is close and the opportunity to make a difference in the game is possible, they give their very most effort, whether they are on the possible winning side or the possible losing side. They give their full effort. When the game is sort of already resolved, both the winners and the losers become somewhat resolved with their situation. And if we were to make that a little more personal for a moment, you might imagine that you're running late for a meeting. And if you know that you're going to be late for the meeting, then you just go on beginning to make up excuses that you're going to tell them about why you're late for the meeting. But if you might be able to make it on time, you are weaving through traffic, you are on the median, you are skirting the ledge of legality to be able to make it possibly to your meeting on time. And there was probably a time in our evolutionary history when there was a biological advantage to being stressed at uncertainty. We are literally hardwired in our brains to hate uncertainty. We will do whatever we can to avoid it. You see, friends, we don't fear change. We fear uncertainty. The homeless person doesn't fear finding a home. They are unsure of what that's going to mean for their friendships. They fear whether they can pay the bill. They don't know who they might disappoint. And all of the unknowns make it less stressful to stay where they are. And maybe the paralytic in our story feels this way too. Maybe it was easier to stay on the side of the healing waters than to dive all the way in. Maybe Jesus wants to know whether this man is really ready for the other side of a healed life. So this morning I ask, where are the places where your brain is beginning to recognize the uncertainty that's around you? Sometimes it comes on all at once. Our spouse gets a medical diagnosis. Our employer begins to do poorly, and we wonder whether we'll be left jobless. Other times, uncertainty can come on a little more slowly. Our kid starts to struggle in school, and we begin to wonder, will they ever be able to get it together? Or maybe your children are a little older and you've seen her use substances and go through joblessness and make bad choices for years, and you just wonder, will she ever make it out again? The one I'll probably never forget was in 2012. I was hosting a retreat at the university for incoming college students. And understand, in 2012, the students had experienced 4 years of their parents' joblessness through recession. And so these students, many of them had known their parents' joblessness or the joblessness of their friends' parents. And we were having this group on the very first night that they had arrived. And I'm asking them, what are some of the things that you are anxious about for college? What are some of the things that you fear for college? And one by one, the students said, I'm afraid I won't be able to get a job when I graduate. These students had been at college for 3 hours, and they were worried whether they would get a job when they graduate. You see, our fear of change is really a fear of uncertainty. And if the fear of uncertainty is hardwired by thousands of years of evolution, how can we respond to our fears in ways that are faithful to God? How can we look towards these fears in healthy ways, in ways that make us integrated and whole persons of God? Well, I think if we go back in the story, we can get a clue from what Jesus is doing. You see, Jesus' situation is very different from the paralytic man in this story, because Jesus has just come into Jerusalem. Now, prior to this, Jesus has been out doing ministry in the rural areas, in the outer regions around the city. And he's now come into Jerusalem, and he's done it during a festival time. So there's people everywhere. We don't even know what festival was. We just know that there are people, the pilgrims, have gathered in the city of Jerusalem, and he has come to a particularly busy social location here at this pool. So whatever miracles and ministry Jesus might have done before, he is on a much larger stage than he has ever been in his ministry. And you might imagine that on this larger stage, in this high season of festival, in a crowd, that the uncertainty that is weighing on Jesus might have him nervous and stressed. Jesus might be a bit apprehensive about how the crowd will react. But this Jesus is a tricky one. He's not afraid of the uncertainty that's in front of him. In fact, it's almost as if he is standing in front of a rushing train of religious authority and begging them to come and get him. You see, first, before Jesus heals the man, he asks a question. He asks a question about healing in the middle of a crowd. And maybe the paralytic man doesn't know who Jesus is, but somebody in the crowd certainly does. And they have begun to lean in to listen to this conversation about healing. Jesus has begun to draw a crowd. And then Jesus does what he knows will make them furious. He heals the man on the Sabbath day. It's a rather odd thing that in this time, religious leaders had discerned that if you healed someone on the Sabbath, that was a form of work. Now, even in their time, and certainly in our time, Jewish people understand that to save a life is not prohibited on the Sabbath. This is why Jewish doctors and nurses can work on the Sabbath. So, it's not actually a violation under some people's reckoning to heal someone on the Sabbath. But this group of religious leaders have decided that it is. And so Jesus has begun to make them quite angry, even with the healing. But Jesus doesn't stop there. He tells the paralytic man to take up your mat and walk. Now listen. If healing is a violation of Sabbath, then you know that carrying the mat is a violation of Sabbath. You're not allowed to carry anything on the Sabbath day. And Jesus, this teacher, this rabbi, has just told the man, pick up your mat and walk. This Jesus is provoking them because he understands that there is a hierarchy of religious rules and authority and laws, and he's trying to push back on this idea that somehow it's a bad thing for the man to be healed on the Sabbath day. Jesus is inviting the controversy, like he's saying, come on, let's bring this thing now. So why isn't Jesus afraid in this moment? Why isn't Jesus afraid of the uncertainty that the conflict is going to bring on? If any of us have a conflict with a coworker or we have a conflict with our spouse, we are immediately stressed and tense about that conversation. We can hardly bring ourselves into that conflict because we are on full alert stress mode. And you might imagine that Jesus in this situation would have a similar kind of stress and uncertainty, but it doesn't stop him from moving forward. Why does he move forward with confidence? I think the key comes from a long-held Jewish practice. They told stories. From childhood, Jewish children had been told the great stories of the faith. They learned of God's faithfulness to Moses and God's faithfulness to David. They learned about how God had intervened for Gideon and had intervened for Noah. They learned how God can part the waters to save you in one moment and bring the waters crashing down to save you in the next moment. They learned that God can bring you through the belly of a whale and God can bring you through the fiery furnace. They learned that this God can provide manna in the desert and can provide the sacrificial goat at the time of offering. And as the stories are recounted to the Jewish boy named Jesus, he is learning to trust God's faithfulness. He's learning that the stories of God are about a God who always shows up, is always faithful, always redeems, comforts, and heals. He knows that the God who showed himself faithful before will show himself faithful again. Jesus may be uncertain about what happens, but he has complete confidence in the one who upholds his life. And if you're sitting here today in the fear of uncertainty, then maybe Jesus has a way forward for you too. Friends, you may not know the future, but you know the one who knows. You may not know how your parents' illness will end, but you know the great physician who will heal all things at the end of time. You may not know whether your son will ever find their way back to Christ, but you know that the one who is able to save all of us. You may not know what your future holds, but you know the one who holds your future. You may not know whether your job is going to work out, but you know the one who owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. You don't know the future, but you know the one who knows. And what you know is that this God is trustworthy. You know that this God always comes through, always shows up, always does the renewing thing, always restoring, always redeeming. This God has shown us that he is watching you and he's watching me. And this God can be trusted. When everything is changing around you, you can be brave because you know the one who holds your future. When everything in your life seems rocky and uncertain, you can be brave because even though you don't know, you know the one who knows. If you're here today and you're afraid of the changes that are happening around you, I come with a word of encouragement. This God is trustworthy and true. You do not need to fear uncertainty because this God has shown himself faithful to you. And today is the day to believe again that this God will do it again. Be brave, my friends, because you know the one who knows. Amen.